Welcome to Psychology to Live By, and today is another Q&A with some very compassionate people. And the podcast to be discussed today is the final of 4 podcasts in the Selfless series, and it's subtitled Building Self-Compassion. Our participants have watched the podcast of that name, which you can see or listen to at my website, drchris.life. But I'll do a quick summary of part 4 now before we jump into our Q&A. So how does one practice self-compassion? Well, an excellent place to start is with Kristen Neff's formulation of self-compassion practice. And she defines it as having 3 elements: mindfulness, or this sort of present moment, non-judgmental awareness; our common humanity, the understanding that one's experience is similar to others, that we're not alone; and self-kindness, using kind gestures, phrases or actions towards oneself. So mindfulness, well, the key task here is to notice one's own negative emotions and thoughts in the present moment. And the distinction is that we proactively draw attention to our negative feelings rather than simply being the negative feelings or being unaware of them and reacting from them. Our common humanity, well, this is the second move, is to see how typically human one's self-criticisms and negativities are. I sometimes call this an anthropological view, as we depersonalise our experience somewhat and see it as typical of our species. Everyone suffers. And just as we wish for those close to us to be happy, to live at ease, etc., we can logically wish that for ourselves. And then self-kindness. And, we show kindness to self as we would typically respond to a friend or loved one in our exact situation. And this kindness can be psychological, physical, or social. So psychologically, we can edit our exaggerated or overly punitive thoughts. Physically, we can do something that eases our distress, like having a bath, exercising, having a massage, or doing a meditation. And socially, we can confide in a trusted mentor or a friend to talk things through. We can seek out social support or just give ourselves downtime with a friend. And of course, we can also practice loving kindness meditation, perhaps starting where it's easiest, with someone you have uncomplicated, affectionate feelings towards, someone you really want to be happy and free of suffering, someone you really desire to be successful. And then you might do the same for acquaintances, and then eventually perhaps for self. And an important thing about self-compassion, it's not always gentle self-caring. Sometimes it's assertive, even fierce action. For example, compassionate self-care means stepping up and protecting oneself, standing with others who've experienced similar affronts, or clearly seeing and speaking from the truth. And finally, another angle on self-compassion is how we talk to ourselves. It turns out that speaking to yourself in the third person is a very compassionate thing to do. This is known as ileism, from the Latin ille, meaning he or that. So remember, the kinder you are to self, the kinder you can be to others. You can live less in reaction and more in action. It's not an indulgence, but a wisdom based in mindfulness and acceptance. It means we can enjoy our life and share that enjoyment in our relations with others. Alrighty, so let's move now to our Q&A. And here are the promised compassionate friends. Welcome, guys, and I hope you enjoyed the podcast. And I'm very interested, as always, in your questions and observations. So who might want to kick off here? Let me see. How about you, Chris? We'll start with you.
Okay. I'm going to start with an anecdote or a story.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Go.
So, because it reminded me of literally a loop that I went through last week, which was a screwed up something, not major, minor, but that knee-jerk reaction is like, man, that was really dumb. Like, what are you doing? And then I think to myself, man, like, why is my response that? I just relax. It's fine. This is no big deal. But then I start thinking, why wasn't my initial reaction just to relax? So I'm beating myself up for beating myself up. And this sort of like meta response to that initial response.
Yes.
Now, out of that though, the good spark out of that was that I pretty quickly acknowledged, okay, like an immediate reaction of negativity was unwarranted and an overreaction. And you don't have to beat yourself up on this. My question is it possible? Is my reaction, had anybody around me in my life done the same thing as I had, wouldn't have been that first knee-jerk negative response. It would have been like, oh, it's no big deal. It's fine. You know what I mean? If my daughter had, done something, I'd be like, it's fine. There's nothing to worry about here. You know what I mean? So why is it possible to have that reaction to yourself screwing up immediately be compassion? Or do I have to just accept that I'm always going to have to go through some version of this, talk myself off the ledge? Like, can I react to myself the same way I react to the world around me, or the people around me?
Okay. This is, I'm sure this is going to be highly relevant to everyone listening. So a couple of thoughts. First off, I might start with personality, because there's going to be quite a diverse type of way of dealing with stuff-ups, so your way is really, is partly because I know you're a highly agreeable person. On agreeableness, you would score very high, right? So agreeable people are going to be much more sensitive to potentially what other people think, and therefore by internalizing that, what I think of me, right? Whereas if you're low on agreeableness, you're much less likely to worry about errors because you're great. The narcissist is right down that end, so they're going to go, it's nothing because I'm so much better than other people anyway, right? And so not everyone's going to have that reaction, and not having that reaction may not be a good thing, right? So, again, at the extreme, the person is a bit narcissistic, if I put it that way. They may not be taking enough account of their errors and their faults and so on, right? And not taking enough accountability and responsibility. All right, that's one part. But I loved your kind of, upset at your upset. This sort of meta level. And I've experienced that myself many times. And Terry, and so it's like, we double down on the upset by going, what's wrong with me? Why can't I just use my intellect to objectively see this is not that important and move on? And then your next question was, and do I have to get triggered in the first place? So let's see what we can, if we can, navigate all of that. Let's start with, do I have to get triggered in the first place? Probably yes. Right. In that, either, what's getting triggered is some sort of evolutionarily important event, or it's some sort of, it's similar to something that's very important that's happened to us in the past, like in family of origin, or, traumas we've had or difficulties. And, so because the brain just automatically associates it with negative emotional experiences in the past, right? And so it just gets triggered. Okay. It makes me think, in reading accounts of people who probably were enlightened, an interesting thing there is that they still get triggered in the sense that they still have, their nervous system still gives them those experiences. What's different, though, by all accounts, is what happens next. They've developed a kind of equanimity so much that they're not identifying even with a very powerful emotion, and thereby it's got nothing to cling to, and it just passes on. It dissolves. So that then points us in a certain direction, doesn't it? And that is to not really desire to never be triggered, because it sets an impossible standard, and in a way it's anti-human.
Right.
But rather, in this self-compassionate way, to kind of hold oneself with affection, even when we're experiencing something uncomfortable. There could be a physical discomfort as well as an emotional one, right? And rather than living out of reaction to it, be so fully engaged with it that it just is allowed to run its own natural course.
Right.
Yeah. So this is a real, I think this is a deep developmental possibility for us. Mm-hmm. You probably already noticed, though, Chris, that you're quicker at getting out of it than you used to be.
Yes.
And
absolutely. Well, in the context that, at some point, especially I would have not ever gotten out of it without some external guidance out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so based on that and continued, mindfulness and attention to it, one could deduce that you'll continue to get better and better and less reactive and more equanimous, more ability to sit with and not identify with, and therefore let these things to roll through you. Yeah. Fantastic. Who's next? I'm breathless with anticipation. Okay, Colleen.
Just to, following what Chris said, I think realize how much help just a little bit of time before you're reacting to anything. I always think about when I'm in a stressful situation, your breathing exercise, how just that changes the dynamic or changes the way you may see a reaction or see what you're frustrated with, or it could be anything, but just a little bit of time is sometimes allows you to be a little bit more reflective and not so much in a negative way.
That's very interesting. That's exactly right too. So just for the listeners, the breathing that Colin referred to is just a breathing exercise that quietens down, it sort of shuts down the fight-flight system in favour of what we call the parasympathetic system, which is basically helps us relax, right? Now, why would that help? Well, if we're in upset, the fight-flight system is triggered, and there's certain mental modes that are associated with it, like hypervigilance, anxiety, faster thinking, usually more catastrophizing, that sort of thing, because we're in danger. Quietening the body, or having a few moments to kind of quieten, we now bring a different mentality to the same situation. So a bit like Chris was talking about, we begin to see it as, that's just a triggering, that's normal, rather than that's proof that I'm no good. And the other thing is about this time piece. You might remember we talked about free will and free won't, and that if we don't have free will, which is quite likely, not in any significant sense, but we might have some sort of veto power, and that we get about 200 to 300 milliseconds to stop something cascading by this sort of reflexive awareness. So taking a nice breath and calming can just give us the mind enough time to actually look at it slightly different way. The exciting thing about that for me is that that there's always a myriad, an infinite, in fact, number of other ways that we can interpret our experience. And it doesn't have to be the one that's initially triggered. And so we can be sculpting ourselves and our experience over time by redirecting attention, by thinking about the situation in different ways, or indeed by attending to things that are more useful. Just like in the last podcast, Terry started attending to dogs pissing on tyres, which was much better than attending to his frustrations. That's terrific. Just that small idea of having some time is so rich. And speaking of Terry, what's going on in that mad genius of yours, Terry?
So as I listened to the podcast, and giving ways or tools to get in that third person, or what I call a split conscious mode,
Yep.
Observing yourself.
Yep.
It kind of reminded me of when I started to meditate and my frustrations with that process initially. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I understood that thoughts were allowed to come in and they're allowed to go. And as long as I didn't cling on to them or give them any thought, they were welcome to pass on by, kind of like a highway.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean I had to watch them. And it was only at that point that I felt that I got benefit out of meditation, because initially they were fast and furious and they slow down and they just didn't exist because I didn't give them any attention. So that's what, out of what you talked about in the podcast and having tools, that's the one that really struck me the most, is nothing to cling to.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Let me see where that takes us, Terry. This idea of you split consciousness or a meta level of awareness is central to self-compassion. Because what's implied in self-compassion is that there's at one level there's an experience that's, to say, unpleasant or uncomfortable, but there's another layer of awareness that can take an attitude to it, and that attitude is just as you've described. They're just thoughts, or we could have added to what you said, Terry. They're just feelings. Yeah. And or even they're just sensations, if it's right. But for example, if someone has some pain, maybe they've got a bad back or something like that, it's then not just, the suffering is not just caused by the sensations. The suffering is massively amplified by all the thoughts and emotions around the sensations. What does this pain mean? Why won't it go away? How long am I going to be suffering from it? Right? And pain is a really good example of what you were talking about, because everyone can relate to it, right? And a lot of there are people in the world who can't take analgesics for various reasons, allergies and so on. And one of the most effective treatments for that is mindfulness training, where people actually pay attention. They just watch and observe the sensations, and gradually all the fears and worries and interpretations and reactions to the sensations drop away, just like you looking at thoughts, and they come and they rise and they pass away. So people actually objectively, two things. They report that they're suffering less in a global sense. But they actually also, which is really strange, they actually report feeling less physical sensation, less pain in the direct sense. And so by analogy, we can take that and apply it to what you're saying, especially around self-compassion. We might sit here in a very kindly, slightly detached fashion, observing the way we're beating ourselves up observing the negative thoughts about self, observing the negative feelings about self. And we can smile in a kind of way, recognizing our humanity and the fact that it's temporary and it's going to pass. And that maybe I'm just going to let it be there until it's done. I heard a lovely analogy a couple of weeks ago about thoughts. As a guy, he's a kind of Dzogchen teacher. It's a type of Buddhism. But he said thoughts are like a model on a catwalk. They come out from behind a curtain or something, and they strut out onto the stage and do a bit of a twirl, and then they go back to where they came from. and it's true, if you just watch thoughts, they just arise, or feelings, they just arise, and then they pass away. And it's us holding on to them that causes the suffering, and holding on to negative views of self, or interpreting what all this means about me. And so we're softening all this self-significance of our thoughts and feelings. All right, guys, I think that's probably it for today, but always such rich questions, challenging, but it's just enjoyable, isn't it, to talk about this, and it's so important. So thank you, my compassionate friends, and we'll see you next time for our next podcast and our next Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Chris.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.